If you are subscribed to our channel, you'll know that we've been doing a multi-part series on our old CJ7 over here. We pulled the engine and transmission out, did a teardown of the engine over there. We've done an in-tank electric fuel pump conversion onto our CJ. And then we went in our last episode and fully rebuilt this engine. If you haven't seen those episodes, go and take a look. It might be interesting to see how we got to this point. Today what we're going to do is assemble our engine back to our transmission and get it back in the Jeep. And hopefully go for a drive with our CJ as soon as we're done with all of that. Once we're done, we're also going to do a lessons learned. There are a number of things that I would have done differently during this teardown and rebuild that would have made it easier for me. And there's no need for you to learn those lessons over again, so I'm going to go in detail what I would have done differently if I could do this project over again. Join us for today's episode and let's get going. So the first thing that we have to do is get the engine off the engine stand over there. So we have connected the engine hoist and we're going to lift the engine off the engine stand. As soon as the engine is off the stand, we're going to come around the back here and disconnect this mounting plate so that we can get to the crank shaft over there, as we need to finish up on the crankshaft that's underneath there. Alright, at the rear of the engine over here on our crankshaft, the first thing that I need to do is install this brass puck. Now this brass puck is sized to fit exactly into the opening in the crankshaft over there, and this is actually the pilot bearing for our manual transmission. The input shaft in our transmission needs to be supported, and so this brass puck fits over the shaft over here and just acts as a support to hold this input shaft so that there's no movement of the input shaft when you have your foot on the clutch. Now it does rotate over there, and that's just a little bit of wear that is going to happen. So usually when you do a transmission, you will also replace this puck over here. So this is actually an interesting one, because this transmission that we're using here is a T5 transmission, and so this is actually a custom made part to adapt the T5 transmission to the 4-liter Jeep. So just be aware that depending on the configuration of your transmission and your engine, you might have a different one here. You might also have a needle bearing that you will use. We're going to go ahead next and get this into the crankshaft. So the next part we're going to install is our flywheel over here. Now you should ideally use a new flywheel, or at least resurface it, but this one over here has hardly ever been used, so it's still brand new, so I'm going to reuse the flywheel. The service manual says that you need to install the flywheel bolts with Loctite 242. Loctite 242 has been upgraded to Loctite 243, which is blue Loctite. So I'm going to put the flywheel onto the crank over there, and then I will use the bolts to get it aligned. And then once it's aligned and in place, I'll remove the bolts. I will put some Loctite on it, and then we're going to torque it to 105 foot-pounds according to the service manual. And when I do the torque, I'm going to do it in a crisscross pattern here, just because that's the way I prefer to do it. Right, so I'm just going to put some torque seal onto these bolts here, just so that I know that they've been checked and torqued off. The next thing that we're going to install is our clutch and our pressure plate over here. Now the one thing that you're going to need is this clutch centering tool. How this tool works is it fits snugly into the pilot bearing over there, so that maintains the center of our crankshaft over here. So the clutch centering tool is splined to the same splines as your clutch disc over here, and what you do is you slide it in, and that allows the clutch disc to center onto the flywheel. Now it's very important that you do get it centered, because the input shaft to the gearbox is going to need to follow this exact same route. It's splined to the clutch and needs to go into the pilot bearing. So if this clutch disc is sitting off-centered like that, there is no way you're going to get your transmission to mount. So do make sure that you have this alignment tool before you get going with this job. Another important thing to note is that the clutch has got a thick side and a flat side over here. Now when I removed this, I marked this as engine side and transmission side. So I know that this clutch needs to go back on in this orientation with a thicker side over there pointing towards the transmission. Another important thing just to note is that most times a flywheel has little dowel pins to help you align the pressure plate over here. Now on this Jeep it does not have dowel pins. 3 of these holes, this one here, and that one at the bottom there, are a slightly smaller diameter than the other holes over there. They actually use these bolt holes as dowel pins. So the procedure that the service manual requires is that you hand start all 6 of the pressure plate bolts, and then once you've hand started those bolts, what you're going to do is you're going to run these 3/4 of the way down, and then you'll run the other 3 all the way down. A little different from most clutches, but that's the way that this one has been set up. So we're going to go ahead now and install this clutch. Right, so what I've done now is I've set my torque wrench to 25 Newton meters, which is half of the 50 Newton meters or 37 foot-pounds that the service manual requires. And I'm taking the non-dowel bolts, and I'm going to make sure that I click all of them off. So that one is done. Right, so they're clicked off. I can now go ahead and then click off the dowel bolts to 25 Newton meters. Right, so with my torque wrench set to 50, I'm going to now go and do the non-dowel bolts first and torque them up to 50 Newton meters or 37 foot-pounds. And the engine's rotating, so what I'm going to have to do next is get my pry bar again over here and stop this engine from rotating. The clutch and the pressure plate are now installed, and my alignment pin is still loose, which means that everything is still aligned. So I'll be able to mount this up to the transmission next. So this next bit is what I most hate about manual transmission. We got to get this engine perfectly aligned with the transmission so that little pilot can slide into that bush that we saw earlier. Now this has to be perfectly aligned, and doing that is rather difficult. So we're going to go ahead and try and get this aligned. One tip that you do want to do is just make sure that when you do this alignment, you don't use the bolts to pull the transmission onto the engine. And the reason is that if that pilot bush has not inserted properly, you can actually smash either the pilot or the input shaft of the transmission. So it needs to slide up and onto the dowel pins over here all by itself, and then you use the bolts just to hold it together. So we're going to go and try and do this. It's probably going to take us a couple of attempts to get this done, but we'll get there. Alright, as I expected, and you no doubt saw, this did not go together very easily. However, it is in place. You can see that the dowel pins over there have engaged. This bolt is still loose. I just kept it for orientation, and same with this one. I was keeping it just to make sure that the orientation was correct. And on this side, again, you can see the dowel pin has engaged over there, and this bolt here is still loose. It was just there to help for alignment. So what we can do now is I will go and put the rest of the bolts in, and then we can torque these bolts up. I'm happy that this engine and transmission are now joined together correctly. So the 2 big 7/16 bolts, one on each side, we're going to torque to 43 foot-pounds. The smaller 3/8 bolts, they're going to 27 foot-pounds. Great, good to go. With the transmission now in place, what we will do is install the starter motor over there, And then once the starter motor is in place, we're going to hoist up the engine and transmission assembly and set it into the Jeep. It's been a rather interesting struggle to get the engine and transmission in, but it's in, it's bolted down. So we're going to go ahead now and do all the connections of all the wires, hoses, power steering, etc. that needs to be connected. So before I start, what I'd like to do is actually take a fuel pressure gauge over here and go and check that my fuel pressure on my rail is actually correct. If you remember correctly in our episode where we did our electric fuel pump, you'll know we checked it over here. So I want to make double sure that our fuel rail does actually have pressure on it. So I'm going to go ahead and connect this up next. So what I've done here is I've connected an external fuel pressure gauge through this pipe here to the port over there on my fuel rail. And so this gauge should be measuring the same pressure as that gauge. I'm going to go ahead now and connect up my fuel pump so that I can get that running. Alright, so there we can see we've got a slight difference in fuel pressure. This one is reading about 45 psi and this one here is reading close to 60 psi. So what I'm going to do is just adjust my fuel pressure slightly and just bring this fuel pressure down just a fraction. One more item I'd like to be able to do is I'd like to be able to manually turn on my electric fans so that if while I'm starting this engine I feel that we need to get some cooling going, I can do that. Now the two controllers that I have over here that run the fans, if you put earth onto pin number 6 over there, those fans will switch on. So I've hooked up this wire to pin 6 and I'm just going to test it now by earthing it here on the battery, and we should have the fans turn on. Alright, that's great. So I know I can manually turn my fans on if I need to. One thing I do want to just check is that we can see the engine controller and read the data. So you can see here the temperature is more or less 73 Fahrenheit at the moment. I'm going to go through and RPMs is what's important to me. We want to get that up to between 1500 and 2000 RPM to run in the cam. And then the last thing we want to look at over here is your throttle position sensor, and we want to see that the throttle position sensor is actually moving as I open the throttle. So we can see the throttle position sensor. I'm a little bit concerned because it is reading 16, and if I open it all the way it's reading 77. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and hop into my XJ, which has a very similar controller, and just check what the XJ is reading, and if that's all good, then we'll go ahead and start up. Now one thing I'm going to have to do is as soon as I start this engine I'm going to need to lift up the RPM to get it to that 1500 to 2000 RPM range. So what I've done is I've just cut this little wooden block, and as I open the throttle over here I'll be able to slide this little wooden block in underneath the throttle there and increase the throttle until I get the throttle opening that I want. If I want it open more I can just slide it in a little deeper over there, which will give me a larger throttle opening. So I'm ready to go ahead and bring the engine RPM up as soon as I've started this engine. Right, here we go. Right, so the engine has started up we can see over here we've got good oil pressure and our temperature is busy coming up. So far everything is running perfectly. Our coolant temperature now is coming up to about 188, 190. Take a look at that little light there. You'll see that our first coolant fan has come on. We should see the second fan turn on shortly. So while this engine was running, I thought it was running a little bit rough, and I disconnected cylinder number 1 over here and didn't hear a noticeable change. So I'm a little bit concerned that we might have a misfire on cylinder number 1. We did our diagnostics on the injector and found that the resistance value was not correct. So we swapped out the injector. Now if you want more information, there is a video that I have made on how we did our diagnostics, and you're welcome to take a look at that. Right, so we've swapped out this injector. We are going to go ahead and start the Jeep now and see if that made any difference. We'll probably pull this wire off again and see if we can hear any change in the note of the engine. Right, so our Jeep is running absolutely perfectly now. We definitely did have a dead injector over there. So glad I changed out the injector and replaced it with a new one. The idle is very, very smooth. Engine is hardly vibrating. So I call it the job well done. Very glad with the results that we have.
Chance to be ruthless.